We come together today, here in the heart of the Amazon, at a pivotal moment in human history. A moment that demands courage.
Everything inside the palace just changed. Prince William's DNA test results were finally revealed, and the truth has thrown the entire royal family into chaos. What was supposed to be a private check has now become a dangerous secret that everyone is desperate to understand. Staff are whispering, phones are ringing non-stop, and every room feels clouded with shock. No one knows what this discovery will do to the family, the crown. But one thing is clear. These results have opened a door that cannot be closed, and the real storm is only beginning. Join us to explore the letter that changed everything. Prince William was in his study in Kensington Palace when the envelope arrived. He sat at his mahogany desk, sorting through the day's correspondence with his usual calm efficiency. He reached for his coffee, still warm, when his assistant knocked gently on the door. "Your Royal Highness, the medical documents you requested have arrived," she said, placing a thick manila envelope on his desk before quietly retreating. William nodded absently, his mind already on the morning's schedule. He had ordered a simple DNA test weeks ago, nothing dramatic. Just a routine medical clarification his doctor had recommended, something about genetic markers and family health history. He slid open the envelope with his letter opener, expecting perhaps 3 or 4 pages at most. But when he pulled out the contents, his brow furrowed. The stack was thick, far thicker than it should have been. He counted the pages quickly. 15. Why would a basic medical report need 15 pages? The first few pages looked normal enough, standard medical jargon, charts with percentages, technical terms he barely understood. He skimmed through them, looking for the simple summary his doctor had promised. Then he turned to page 7, and his entire world stopped spinning. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. William read the line again, certain he had misunderstood. Then, a third time. The words refused to change. They sat there on the crisp white paper, black ink spelling out something impossible, something that couldn't be true. His hands began to shake, just slightly at first, then more noticeably. The paper rustled in his grip. He set down his coffee cup before he could spill it, but he barely registered the action. His eyes were fixed on the document, scanning the technical language, searching desperately for some indication that this was a mistake, a clerical error, someone else's report mixed in with his own. But there, at the top of every page, was his name, his birth date, his reference number. William stood up abruptly, his chair scraping harshly against the wooden floor. He walked to the window, pressing one hand against the cool glass, trying to steady himself. Outside, the palace gardens stretched peacefully before him, unchanged and unchanging. Gardeners moved about their morning duties. A security officer walked his regular patrol. Everything looked exactly as it always had, but nothing would ever be the same again. He returned to the desk, forcing himself to read more carefully this time. The document contained comparisons he had never requested, genetic profiles he had never asked to see, technical analysis of paternal lineage that went far beyond what his doctor had ordered, page after page of data that told a story he had never wanted to hear, had never even imagined could exist. One section compared markers against known royal family profiles. Another showed statistical probabilities that made his stomach turn. A third contained dates and reference numbers that suggested this testing had been done more than once, by more than one laboratory, as though someone wanted to be absolutely certain of the results. William's mind raced through possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Had someone made a terrible mistake at the laboratory? Had samples been switched, mislabeled, contaminated? But the report was so detailed, so thorough, checked and cross-checked against multiple databases. These weren't the findings of a single careless technician. This was a comprehensive, deliberate analysis. He thought of his childhood, his mother, the endless speculation and gossip that had surrounded the royal family for decades, rumors he had always dismissed as tabloid fiction, the desperate inventions of journalists with nothing better to write about. He had grown up knowing that conspiracy theories swirled around his family like autumn leaves in the wind, persistent, annoying, but ultimately meaningless. Except now he held evidence in his hands that suggested some whispers might not have been whispers at all, but truth spoken too quietly to be heard. William sat back down heavily, the leather chair creaking under his weight. He spread the pages across his desk, trying to make sense of the pattern, trying to find some logical explanation that would make this nightmare disappear. His training in crisis management, his years of military discipline, his lifetime of maintaining composure under pressure, all of it felt useless now. The office around him seemed to blur at the edges, the bookshelves lined with history texts and biographies of his ancestors, the portraits on the walls showing generations of his family, the royal crest embossed on his official stationery. Everything that had once felt solid and certain now seemed like stage props in an elaborate play where he had never known his real role. He picked up one particular page, studying a chart that showed genetic markers highlighted in yellow. The technical language was dense, but the conclusion was painfully clear. The probability percentages were stark. The comparison data was unambiguous. This wasn't speculation or theory. This was science, cold and precise and devastating. William's phone buzzed with a reminder about his next appointment, but he ignored it. He couldn't imagine sitting through a meeting about charitable initiatives or agricultural policy right now. He couldn't imagine making small talk with diplomats or reviewing budget reports. The ordinary business of his life felt impossibly distant. His thoughts turned to his father, King Charles, probably having breakfast at this very moment in his own quarters. Did he know? Had he always known? Was this why certain photographs from William's childhood had always carried an odd tension? Why certain family dynamics had never quite made sense? Why his mother had sometimes looked at him with such fierce protectiveness mixed with sadness? Or was his father as much in the dark as William had been 20 minutes ago? William strode toward the door, the report clutched tightly in his hand. His mind was made up. There was only one person who might explain this, who might help him understand how everything he thought he knew about himself could be so terribly, impossibly wrong. His father had to answer for this. Now. The confrontation no son should have. William's footsteps echoed through the palace corridors as he made his way to his father's private office. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighted with questions that shouldn't exist. The morning light streaming through the tall windows seemed too bright, too cheerful for what he was about to do. He didn't knock, protocol demanded it, but this wasn't a moment for protocol. William pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped inside. King Charles looked up from his desk, surprise flickering across his face. He was reviewing papers, reading glasses perched on his nose, a cup of tea steaming at his elbow. Everything about the scene was ordinary, comfortable, familiar. It made what William was about to do feel even more unreal. Charles set down his pen, his expression shifting from surprise to concern. He could see this wasn't about policy or scheduling conflicts. Something had shattered. William crossed the room and placed the report on the desk between them. The pages seemed to glow white against the dark wood, accusatory in their silence. Charles picked up the first page, his eyes scanning the text. William watched his father's face carefully, searching for any sign of recognition, of guilt, of confirmation. What he saw was worse than he'd prepared for. Charles's expression crumbled from confusion to understanding to something that looked like fear. The king sank back into his chair, still holding the report. His hands weren't quite steady. He asked where William had gotten it. William's voice rose with frustration. That wasn't the question he needed answered, not whether it was true, not how to explain it, just where it came from. The question that mattered hung in the air between them, sharp as a blade. Was any of this true? Charles set down the papers and pressed his fingers to his temples. For a long moment he said nothing. The silence stretched until William thought he might scream just to break it. There were rumors, Charles finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Years ago, before you were born, even after, but they were just rumors, the kind that always swirl around this family. William felt his composure cracking. His father had known there were questions about this, and he'd never said a word. Charles looked up, genuine anguish in his eyes. He explained how people invented stories about their family constantly, examining every photograph and public appearance for scandal. He couldn't take every whisper seriously. It would drive a person mad. William gestured at the report. This wasn't a whisper. This was science. This was evidence. Charles stood again, agitation making him restless. He pointed out something William hadn't considered. This report was far more comprehensive than a simple medical test. Someone wanted William to see this. Someone wanted to create exactly this moment. The thought stopped William cold. His father was right. The report was too detailed, too thorough for a routine medical inquiry. Someone had deliberately compiled this, made sure it reached him. But that didn't answer the fundamental question. William asked if his father would have ever told him. If this hadn't landed on his desk, would he have lived his entire life not knowing there were doubts about who he really was? "You are my son," Charles said firmly, meeting William's eyes. "That has never been in doubt. Not for me. Not ever." But that wasn't what William had asked. Charles walked to the window, his back to William. The morning sun illuminated the silver in his hair, made him look older, more fragile than William usually allowed himself to notice. He spoke carefully about the difficulties in his marriage, the periods of strain and distance. The whole world knew about those times. Yes, there were rumors during those difficult years, cruel, vicious rumors that hurt them both. But nothing was ever proven because there was nothing to prove. William demanded an explanation for the report. Charles turned back to face him. He couldn't explain it without understanding how it was created, who authorized the testing. Where the comparison samples came from. Genetic testing wasn't simple. This required access to royal family genetic profiles, historical samples, and extensive databases. Someone with significant resources and connections did this deliberately. William's mind was racing. His father's points were logical, but they felt like deflection, like a politician's answer to a journalist's hard question. What were they supposed to do now? Charles moved back to his desk, his expression hardening into something more resolute. They needed to consult someone they could trust absolutely, a genetic advisor with impeccable credentials and discretion. They had to verify this information through proper channels before reacting to it. They could not let this become public until they understood exactly what they were dealing with. William's voice was hollow. What if it was true? What if the testing was legitimate and the conclusions were accurate? Then we deal with it as a family, Charles said. But carefully, thoughtfully, not in anger or panic. William wanted to argue, to demand immediate answers that his father clearly couldn't provide. But underneath his hurt and confusion, he recognized the wisdom in caution. A scandal like this could tear apart everything they'd built, everything they represented. He told his father he needed time to process this. Neither man noticed the shadow that moved quickly away from the corridor just outside, footsteps retreating silently across the marble floor. Someone had heard everything, and soon the secret that should have stayed buried would begin spreading like poison through the palace walls. When secrets become headlines. The junior assistant had only been working at the palace for 6 months. She was young, eager, still amazed that she walked the same halls as royalty every single day. That morning, she had been delivering fresh linens to the upper floors when she heard the raised voices behind the king's office door. She should have kept walking, she knew that, but something in Prince William's tone made her pause, made her press closer to the wall, made her listen to words that were never meant for her ears. DNA report, paternal lineage, rumors, proven. Her heart pounded as the pieces came together. She hurried away before anyone could catch her, but the information burned in her mind like a fever. By lunchtime, she couldn't stop thinking about it. By afternoon, she had made a decision that would change everything. She found the number online, a journalist known for royal coverage, someone who had broken stories before. Her hands shook as she typed the message on her personal phone, sitting in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the palace. "I have information about a bloodline crisis in the royal family, something they're trying to hide." The response came within minutes. The journalist wanted to meet, wanted details, wanted proof. She didn't have proof, not really, but she had heard enough. And apparently, that was enough to start a fire. Within hours, whispers began appearing on social media. Vague posts from anonymous accounts, cryptic tweets suggesting a royal scandal was brewing. Nothing specific yet, nothing concrete, just enough smoke to make people start looking for flames. The posts multiplied, discussion forums lit up with speculation. Royal watchers, conspiracy theorists, and curious citizens all began asking the same questions. What was happening at the palace? Why the sudden security increase? What were they hiding? The palace communications team didn't even see it coming. William sat in his private quarters with Catherine. The DNA report spread on the table between them. He had told her everything, his voice cracking as he explained what the pages meant, what they suggested about his entire identity. Catherine listened without interrupting, her hand holding his. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her mind clearly working through the implications. "We'll get through this," she said simply, her voice steady even as her eyes showed worry. "Whatever the truth is, we'll face it together." But even as she spoke those calming words, she could sense the storm gathering around them. She had lived in this world long enough to know how quickly things could spiral, how a whisper could become a shout, how a private matter could explode into a public crisis. Her phone buzzed, then William's. Then both phones began lighting up with notifications, messages from advisors, warnings from the security team. Something was happening online. Charles was in the middle of reviewing agricultural policy reports when his private secretary burst in, tablet in hand, face pale. The king took one look at the trending topics and felt his stomach drop. He immediately called an emergency meeting. Senior advisors, communications directors, legal counsel, security chiefs. They assembled in the private conference room within 20 minutes, faces grave, voices hushed. The palace corridors filled with unusual activity. Staff members moved quickly, whispering to each other, sensing that something major was unfolding. Security protocols were quietly upgraded, certain entrances were restricted, extra guards appeared at key positions. Charles stood at the head of the conference table, his jaw set. They needed to control this situation before it controlled them. They needed a strategy, a unified message, a way to stop the bleeding before it became a hemorrhage. But how do you fight a story when you don't even know what's being said, when the rumors are moving faster than facts, when the truth itself is still unclear? Advisors debated approaches. Should they issue a denial? Ignore it completely? Launch an investigation into the leak? Every option had risks. Every path had pitfalls. Phones around the table kept buzzing, chiming, and lighting up with updates. The online chatter was growing louder by the minute. News outlets were starting to pick up the story, carefully phrasing their coverage to avoid libel, but clearly sensing blood in the water. William was back in his study, trying to process the speed at which his private crisis was becoming public property. When his email notification chimed, he almost didn't check it. His inbox was flooded with messages from concerned friends, curious acquaintances, reporters fishing for comments. But something made him look. The sender's name made his blood run cold. James Mitchell, senior correspondent for one of Britain's largest newspapers. The subject line was simple: "We need to talk." William's hand hesitated over the mouse. Part of him wanted to delete it unread, pretend it didn't exist, but he knew that was impossible now. He clicked. The email was brief, professionally worded, and absolutely devastating. William read it twice, then a third time. His hands had gone numb. The journalist had the actual documents, not rumors, not speculation. The evidence itself. The storm hadn't just arrived. It was already inside the walls, and there was nowhere left to hide. The choice between truth and silence. William made his decision in the darkest hours of the night. While the palace slept, while his children dreamed peacefully in their beds, while Catherine lay beside him trying to hide her worry, he stared at the ceiling and knew what he had to do. He couldn't hide behind palace walls and legal threats. He couldn't let spokespeople and communications teams handle this. If someone had his private medical information, if they were planning to publish it for the world to see, then he needed to face them directly, as himself, not as a title or an institution. By morning, he had sent the reply. He would meet the journalist, alone, in private, just the two of them. His security team objected immediately. His advisors called it reckless. Even Catherine, always his calm anchor, questioned whether this was wise. But William's mind was set. This wasn't about protocol or strategy anymore. This was about his life, his identity, his truth. They chose a quiet spot along the Thames, far from the palace, far from prying eyes and cameras, a bench near a walking path where early morning joggers passed by without a second glance. normal people living normal lives, unaware that 30 feet away, a prince was about to negotiate with a journalist over the future of the monarchy. James Mitchell arrived exactly on time, carrying a leather messenger bag and an expression that was neither hostile nor friendly. He was older than William expected, maybe in his 50s, with gray touching his temples and lines around his eyes that suggested decades of chasing stories. They sat at opposite ends of the bench. For a moment, neither spoke. The river flowed past them, indifferent to the weight of what was about to be discussed. William broke the silence first. He asked to see what the journalist had. Mitchell hesitated, then reached into his bag and pulled out a folder. Inside were photocopies, slightly grainy but perfectly legible. Pages from the DNA report, the same pages that had shattered William's world days ago, the highlighted sections, the comparison charts, the devastating conclusions. William's jaw tightened as he looked through them. Someone had given this man everything, not just hints or summaries, but actual documentation that should have been completely confidential. He asked how Mitchell had obtained them. A source, the journalist said simply. Someone who felt the public had a right to know. William looked up sharply. The public's right to know. That phrase that journalists loved, that turned private pain into entertainment, that justified tearing apart people's lives in the name of transparency. "Do you have children?" William asked suddenly. The question caught Mitchell off guard. He nodded slowly. "2 daughters," he said. William leaned forward, his voice quiet but intense. He painted a picture for the journalist. His own children, innocent and young, waking up to see their father's identity questioned on every news site and television screen. Schools filled with children asking cruel questions. A family torn apart not by truth or lies but by speculation and scandal. A nation divided, its institutions questioned, its stability shaken. This wasn't just about him, William explained. This was about the damage that immediate publication would cause before anyone even knew if the information was accurate. These were photocopies from a report whose origin was still unknown, whose testing methods hadn't been verified, whose very existence raised questions about who wanted this information public and why. Mitchell listened without interrupting. His expression was harder to read now, the professional journalist's mask slipping to reveal something more human underneath. "These are serious allegations," Mitchell finally said. "If they're true, people deserve to know. The line of succession, the legitimacy of the crown, these aren't private matters. And if they're false," William countered, "if this is misinformation, deliberate or accidental, and you publish it anyway, what then? Can you unring that bell?" The journalist was quiet. They both knew the answer. William made his request. 24 hours. Just one day to verify the information, to conduct proper testing through legitimate channels, to understand what they were really dealing with. Then, regardless of the outcome, he would address it publicly. No hiding, no cover-ups, just time to separate truth from speculation. Mitchell studied him for a long moment. William could see the internal struggle playing out behind the man's eyes. The journalist's duty to break news versus the human recognition of what that news would cost. The career-making story versus the lives it would destroy. 24 hours, Mitchell finally agreed. "But after that, with or without your statement, I'm publishing this story as already results that no one could question or dispute." By afternoon, they had found someone, a genetics specialist with impeccable credentials, no royal connections, and a laboratory that handled sensitive cases with absolute discretion. The doctor agreed to see William immediately, understanding the urgency without needing to be told the full context. Catherine went with him. She held his hand in the car, sat beside him in the private medical suite, and remained close as the doctor explained the testing process. A simple cheek swab, analysis that would take several hours, results that would be definitive. The doctor asked if William wanted to know the details of what they'd be testing for. "Everything," William said quietly. "I need to know everything." The swab took only seconds, such a small, simple thing to potentially upend centuries of history. The doctor labeled the sample carefully, assured them the results would be available by morning, and promised absolute confidentiality. William and Catherine returned to find the palace in barely controlled chaos. Staff members moved with unusual urgency. Advisors clustered in corners, speaking in low voices. The communications office was working around the clock, preparing statements for scenarios they hoped would never happen. Charles looked like he'd aged a decade in 3 days. William found his father in the library, staring at portraits of their ancestors, faces that gazed down from the walls with expressions of certainty and authority that now felt hollow. They didn't speak at first. What was there to say that hadn't already been said? The king's guilt hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. All the years of unasked questions, unspoken doubts, buried secrets that should have been addressed when William was young enough to process them before they became weapons in a stranger's hands. Charles finally spoke, his voice rough. He said he was sorry, not just for the current crisis, but for everything that led to it, for the dysfunction in his marriage, for the environment that created doubts, for never having the courage to address the rumors directly. William didn't know if he was ready to forgive, but he recognized the pain in his father's confession. They were both trapped now, waiting for science to tell them who they really were. The communications team worked through the night on two versions of a public statement. One, if the results confirmed William's royal lineage. One, if they didn't. Both carefully worded, both prepared for maximum damage control, both acknowledging that the speculation had reached a point where silence was no longer an option. Outside the palace walls, the world continued to buzz with speculation. Social media was ablaze with theories. News outlets were preparing special coverage. Royal experts and commentators were being booked for interviews. Everyone sensed that something enormous was about to break. William barely slept. He lay awake beside Catherine, her hand in his, both of them pretending they weren't terrified of what morning would bring. His phone sat on the night.